They didn't just bury the boy, they sealed him in a wine crate, carved crosses into his cheeks, and left a note that simply read, "He speaks for them now." This is not a folk tale. This is a real account from Ashwood, Vermont, an isolated American town that vanished from maps after a terrifying series of events in 1892, now referred to as the Ashwood Vampire Panic. What investigators found beneath St. Decimus Chapel would haunt the eastern seaboard for generations, with whispers of forbidden rituals, blood-written ledgers, and children said to return hollow-eyed and wrong. The case was quietly buried by both church and state. But some stories refuse to stay dead. This is the forgotten terror that history tried to erase. In the fall of 1892, a railway surveyor named Ellis Granger veered off his planned route near the foothills of Vermont's Green Mountains and stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. In a moss-covered clearing less than half a mile from the old Ashwood timber road, he discovered a wooden crate half buried in the soil, its surface etched with scorched symbols that did not match any known language. When the lid was pried open, they expected contraband. Instead, they found the preserved corpse of a young boy, his mouth sewn shut with copper wire, his chest branded with a reversed crucifix, and his body perfectly intact despite the cold. No one had reported a missing child. No one recognized his face, and yet clutched in his hand was a folded page torn from a parish hymnal, with the name St. Decimus Chapel written in dried blood. That's where the real nightmare begins. He wasn't buried. He was sealed. Trapped in a wine crate reinforced with iron nails and smeared with lamb's blood, the boy's body was discovered half a mile outside Ashwood, a town that even in 1892 was already considered cursed land. The man who found him, Ellis Granger, had no reason to be there. He was charting a rail route that had long since been abandoned on official maps. Locals warned him not to follow the timberline. They said the woods past the ridge were not meant for measuring, but curiosity always finds the cursed. When Granger pried open the crate, what he saw didn't belong to nature or man. The child, about 10 years old, was eerily preserved, pale as snow with no sign of decay. His lips were sewn shut with copper wire, and ancient runes had been burned across his collarbones in perfect symmetry. Most unsettling of all, though, his eyes were open, wide, wet, watching, and in his clenched hand was a page torn from a hymnal inked with one name that hadn't been spoken in years, St. Decimus Chapel. But this boy wasn't from Ashwood, and soon the town would wish it had never seen him. No insects touched him, not even the flies. When Sheriff Amos Langley arrived at the site that morning, he expected to find a case of exposure or family tragedy lost to the woods. But the moment he laid eyes on the boy in the crate, the air itself seemed to thicken. Birds stopped singing. The deputy vomited without warning. And according to the coroner's initial notes now redacted, the body was warm to the touch and appeared to blink. There were no footprints around the crate, no signs of struggle. Just the boy staring up from a box soaked in iron and salt with a hymnal page gripped in rigor mortis. The stains on the page were identified as dried human blood. But the ink used to scrawl St. Decimus Chapel, it wasn't ink at all. It was bile. The body was transported in silence, and the crate was burned by order of the church. But the real question was never how the boy died. It was how long he had been waiting, and what he'd been waiting for. The answer they'd discover was buried beneath the floorboards of a chapel that had been locked for over 40 years. The chapel had no door, but something was knocking from the inside. When authorities traced the torn hymnal page back to St. Decimus, they were met with confusion. The church had been officially decommissioned in 1851 after a lightning strike during a funeral ignited its steeple, killing 7, including the priest delivering the sermon. The building was never rebuilt, yet somehow the structure remained intact. Locals claimed it had simply been left to rot, though anyone who passed near the grove claimed to hear soft chanting echoing through the trees even in winter. Sheriff Langley, accompanied by 2 deputies and a local historian named Miriam Cobb, arrived on site 3 days after the boys' discovery. What they found made no sense. There was no visible entrance, no door, no hinges, not even seams. The wood was blackened but unburnt, the stained glass windows covered from the inside, with pages torn from Bibles, some written in a language no one recognized. The air around the chapel was 10 degrees colder, and according to Cobb's diary, our shadows moved before we did. Then came the sound. A single knock from beneath the altar. Just once, but loud enough to split the silence. And none had knocked first. You don't knock at St. Decuma's. You listen. And what Sheriff Langley heard inside that chapel would unravel everything Ashwood thought it knew about its past. When they finally breached the outer wall, what waited inside was not dust and rot, but preservation purpose, and something that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. The floorboards were breathing. That was the first thing Deputy Keller said when the light hit the altar. It wasn't metaphor. The wooden planks beneath their boots seemed to rise and fall, not violently, not rhythmically, but subtly, like a body suppressing a final breath. The chapel's interior was immaculate. No dust, no cobwebs. The crucifix above the altar hadn't fallen. It had been inverted and nailed that way, with what looked like femur bones. The pews were perfectly aligned, each one with a hymnal placed neatly at the centre, all open to the same song, He Who Waits Below. There were no records of such a hymn in any known Protestant or Catholic canon. The walls were covered in children's handwriting, dozens of names written over and over in red ink that tested positive for bovine blood. Sheriff Langley called for silence, hoping to steady the group's nerves. That's when the chapel responded. A slow creaking sigh echoed beneath them like 1,000 whispers trapped under the wood. And then, as if beckoning, the altar slid back on its own. What they saw beneath it wasn't a staircase. It was a shaft descending straight into the earth. The shaft was lined with mirrors, but none of them reflected the living. Deputy Keller was the first to descend lantern in hand, lowering himself on rusted iron rungs that vanished into blackness. As he moved downward, the walls began to shimmer, not with moisture but with polished glass panels embedded in the rock, each no wider than a child's coffin. Sheriff Langley followed, noting something deeply wrong. They could see Keller in the flesh, but in the mirrors he was missing. Instead, the reflection showed someone else, same uniform, same lantern, but a slightly different face, older, and with eyes that didn't blink. The deeper they went, the more the air thickened, sour metallic and warm like breath. At 40 feet down, the passage opened into a room. A circular chamber carved into the stone, lined with pews made of human vertebrae, all facing a single wooden pulpit. On it sat a book bound in skin, still wet to the touch. The pages weren't written in ink, but branded with heat, and the names inside matched the children from the chapel walls. But several entries had been crossed out violently with teeth marks, not ink, and one final page had just been added with the name of Deputy Keller. Keller never screamed, he just stopped being there. One blink and he was gone. No footsteps, no sound. Just an empty space where he had been standing seconds before. Sheriff Langley called his name once, twice, pistol drawn, but the silence that answered was dense and unnatural, like the room itself had swallowed sound. The others tried to retrace steps, scanning the floor walls and ceiling for exits, traps, anything but. There were no seams, no holes, no breaks in the stone. Then the pulpit turned by itself, slow and deliberate, revealing the underside, a mirror panel facing downward. In its reflection, they didn't see themselves. They saw Keller standing still, unmoving, his eyes open wide and mouth agape, as if screaming silently behind glass. He wasn't in the room. He was beneath it, trapped somewhere else. Miriam Cobb dropped to her knees, clutching her chest. She whispered that the floor was humming, vibrating like a heartbeat. One of the deputies grabbed her, but her fingernails were bleeding, her eyes unfocused. And then she said it. He's still watching. The boy in the crate. He's not gone. He's only changed seats. From that moment on, none of them would ever be able to agree on what was real. The town began to forget on purpose. Within days of the incident, Ashwood's records were scrubbed clean. Property maps erased the chapel entirely. The boy's body was buried without ceremony, his crate burned in secret. But what Sheriff Langley and the survivors couldn't erase was what followed them home. Because some reflections don't stay in mirrors. Sheriff Langley started talking to someone no one else could see. It began 3 nights after their return from the chapel. He boarded up the station windows, refused calls, and scrawled pages of strange symbols across every surface of his office symbols that matched the runes burned into the boy's body. Miriam Cobb, once a respected local historian, was found wandering barefoot along the timberline, whispering to trees and holding her hands out like lanterns. When questioned, she repeated one phrase: the boy was never alone. Meanwhile, Deputy Ramos, once steady as stone, resigned. Without a word, packed his family into a car and drove it into the Ashwood quarry. All were recovered. None had their eyes. Every attempt to investigate the chapel again was met with resistance. Local clergy denied it ever existed. County records claimed the land had been used for livestock. But residents of Ashwood began reporting odd sightings: children walking backward in the fog, hymnals appearing in mailboxes, windows frosting over from the inside. One farmer claimed his wife had started humming a tune in her sleep, "He Who Waits Below." She died choking on dirt. The deeper they buried the truth, the more it refused to stay down. Ashwood's children stopped casting shadows. It wasn't immediate. It began with one boy seen standing perfectly still at recess, his arms limp, eyes glazed, yet smiling faintly at the empty sky. The next day, a teacher noticed her class photo had changed. One child's face had been replaced, not blurred, not damaged, replaced with the boy from the crate. Same carved cheeks, same wide grin. The town tried to rationalize, blamed the stress, the media, the trauma of Keller's disappearance. But how do you explain the choir recital where 26 children sang a song no one had taught them in a language that made the church organ bleed pitch? Pastor McKinney suffered a seizure mid-sermon when a girl in the third pew handed him a folded napkin. On it was written, "He speaks for them now," in his late mother's handwriting. She died in 1962. By the end of the month, mirrors were removed from homes. Radios played static hymns between stations, and Sheriff Langley, last seen digging in his backyard at midnight, left a single phrase scrawled across his barn in black oil. The reflection came home. No one could deny it anymore. Something had escaped that chapel, and it was choosing new mouths. It wasn't just the town anymore. People outside started dreaming about Ashwood. Truckers passing through claimed they saw a chapel on fire that didn't appear on any GPS. Hikers found hymnals buried beneath tree roots, pages still warm. A podcaster in Michigan interviewed a caller who described a boy inside a crate, scratching "Open me" from the inside. When asked how he knew, the man said, "I dreamed the dirt." Back in Ashwood, animals refused to enter the eastern woods. Birds flew in circles until they dropped from exhaustion. One night the fog returned, thick, heavy, tasting like copper. Every phone in town rang at once. No voices. Just breathing. A slow, hungry inhale. The next morning, Miriam Cobb was found in the sheriff's office. Eyes gouged out, tongue replaced with a rolled page from the chapel hymn book. No blood. Just dirt. She'd carved something into her forearms before she died. He who waits is waking. Survivors began gathering in silence at the chapel, ruins each midnight forming a circle, heads bowed toward the soil. No one invited them. No one dared interrupt. Because by now, even the skeptics agreed something ancient had been remembered. There was no storm, no earthquake yet. The ground split open beneath the old chapel. Locals said it sounded like a child exhaling. What rose from that fissure wasn't fire or smoke. It was song. A melody no throat could sing, no ear could forget. And it carried with it the truth of what Ashwood had buried. It was never a chapel. That's what the final report, redacted, buried, but leaked by a whistleblower, concluded. Beneath the structure, archaeologists uncovered a spiral chamber lined with mirrors facing inward, not for reflection, but for containment. Carbon dating placed the lower levels centuries before Ashwood's founding, possibly older than the state itself. Symbols etched into the stone were traced back to pre-Columbian civilizations, yet none matched any known tribal dialects. The crate wasn't a coffin, it was a vessel, and the boy wasn't dead when they buried him. He was an offering, half-born, half-made, part human, part echo. His scream wasn't a sound, it was a signal. The carvings on his skin weren't random. They were coordinates pointing to other forgotten places just like this. What the town thought was exorcism was awakening. And when they opened the altar, they didn't release a demon. They broke a seal. A seal meant to hold something in place, something that remembers every name ever whispered in fear. The boy had no birth certificate, no hospital record, no missing child report matched his description. His fingerprints didn't exist in any federal database, and DNA analysis returned a chilling anomaly, partial match to multiple residents of Ashwood dead and alive. Not lineage, not ancestry, duplication. He was a mosaic stitched together from fragments of memory, voice, and bone. One doctor claimed the child's vocal cords were double-layered, allowing him to speak in two tones at once, though no one ever heard him utter a word. But audio engineers analysing footage from the chapel discovered a second layer of sound hidden beneath the static, a reversed recitation of local obituaries dating back a century. Every name whispered in his presence began to disappear from town records, erased as if they had never existed. A librarian went mad after opening a locked drawer and finding her own childhood diary rewritten in a hand she didn't recognize with dates that hadn't happened yet. By the time they realized the boy wasn't a who but a what, the town's collective memory had already begun to unravel. The crate was never built to hold a body, it was built to hold a question. Inside, forensic teams found layers of lead bone, ash copper wire, and scratched prayers in over 20 dead languages. One phrase repeated across every surface he walks when named. When researchers replayed security footage frame by frame, they noticed the boy's eyes closed, for hours, flickered open exactly 1 second before each technical malfunction. A pastor who attempted to bless the crate began coughing up seawater despite never leaving inland. 3 days later, he was found drowned in his own tub, his lungs full of brackish fluid, his mirror shattered. The town's power grid failed at precisely 3:16 a.m. for 7 consecutive nights. And on the 8th night, a third bell, one no one had seen, began to ring beneath the chapel ruins. Seismologists claimed there was no bell. But recordings captured something worse, a voice underneath the ringing saying, "Let me remember you." What shattered wasn't just logic or belief, it was the illusion of separation between memory, identity, and something far more ancient than death. They thought it ended in 1872 when the chapel fire claimed 13 lives and the altar collapsed into the earth. But fire was never the danger. It was the containment method. Ashwood's founders weren't saints. They were keepers jailers of something that couldn't be killed, only forgotten. And forgetting required ritual 3 bells, 3 breaths, and the silence of witnesses too scared to speak. But the boy's arrival broke the cycle. Every child born after his excavation bore a strange mark, not a scar, but a map. A spiral etched just beneath the skin that glowed faintly in infrared. One child began sleepwalking into the forest each night, carving names into trees, names of people who would die days later. Another drew a blueprint of the original chapel by memory, though it had burned long before she was born. The veil wasn't thinning. It was learning how to enter without permission, how to speak without voice, and how to rebuild itself, using what we left behind: our names, our grief, our silence. What was buried wasn't a secret. It was a seed. And now it had roots. They finally opened the third bell. Not rang it, opened it. The artifact wasn't a bell at all, but a vessel, shaped like one forged from fused human teeth and oxidized silver. Inside was a rolled vellum scroll stitched with human hair and soaked in embalming fluid. No ink, just pressure markings like something had been written from the inside out. Linguists went silent. Not because they didn't understand it, but because they did. It was English. A transcript of events that hadn't happened yet. Names, locations, times of death, each one accurate to the minute, days before they occurred. One name repeated more than the rest, the narrators. People who read past the 6th line reportedly began to speak in mirrors, their reflections lagging several seconds behind. One mother claimed her son's voice began coming from the family radio, describing dreams she hadn't had yet. Scientists called it a mass delusion. But when they traced the scroll's material, they found it matched tissue from the boy's lungs. Not DNA compatible, but time compatible. As if his breath had been preserved centuries before he was born. This wasn't prophecy. This was instruction. And we'd already followed it. Ashwood was never evacuated. It simply stopped existing on paper. No forwarding addresses, no county records, no satellite data. It's as if the town agreed to forget itself. 2. But memory isn't a place, it's a virus. And what began beneath that chapel is no longer contained by coordinates. The final toll of the third bell still hasn't come. No one speaks of Ashwood, but everyone avoids the turnoff. The map marks only trees where houses once stood. Mail sent to the old zip code returns with no stamp, just a red smear, and the word remember scrawled where an address should be. Survivors. What few remain describe vivid dreams they never had before a chapel upside down submerged in ink, children humming backward hymns and a woman ringing a bell made of bone. A forensic pathologist who studied the case developed sudden aphasia, speaking only in fragments of Latin he never learned. His final words were caught on voicemail. The chapel breathes. It remembers us. Every full moon, a ripple appears. On satellite thermal scans, a heat signature shaped like a bell. Nothing grows in the soil there, yet birds never stop circling overhead. Every anomaly, every thread of data leads back to one name, one family, one forgotten prayer. This isn't just a haunting, it's a recursive wound, a memory loop stitched into time itself, bleeding through every system meant to keep her safe. And still, no one dares to ask who rang the third bell. The nightmares didn't end when the town vanished from the records they just evolved. People who watched the footage even briefly began reporting auditory hallucinations. A wet thud, a child's laugh played in reverse, the faint tolling of a bell submerged in static. One nurse who tended to a survivor gouged her own ears out after scribbling the phrase "she walks between the walls" over and over in blood. Veterans who once patrolled that zone reported seeing children with mouths sewn shut, standing just beyond their headlights. Even decades later, the trauma persists, not in memory, but in instinct. Dogs refuse to walk past the Ashwood perimeter, and compasses spin even when turned off. There's a term for what lingers in these kinds of places: residual haunt, psychic residue, imprint, trauma. None of them feel big enough. Because this isn't a stain. It's an active intelligence feeding, remembering, adapting. And every time someone tells the story, she hears it too, and the echo gets louder. They demolished the final remnants of Ashwood in 1993, flattened the soil, burned the trees, salted the earth. But something still breathes beneath it. Satellite images show shifting impressions at night, as if the ground forgets it's supposed to be still. Locals speak of a humming under the teeth when they drive too close to where the entrance once stood. One geologist claimed the bedrock pulses every 27 days, exactly matching the screams recorded on loop by military surveillance mics. Families of the missing still receive blank postcards with no return address, postmarked from towns that no longer exist. Some survivors whisper about a figure made of moths appearing only during sleep paralysis, who points at your chest and says, "You were there." The deeper you dig, the more you realize this wasn't a haunting. It was a colonization of thought, an infection of memory. Ashwood never wanted to be forgotten. It wanted to be shared. And now that you've heard the story, you've invited it in too. There's a pattern emerging now, a disturbing consistency in people who visited Ashwood and never truly returned. Not just physically, but psychologically rewired. Several former staff and test subjects have since been institutionalized, each sketching the same symbol, an inverted tree with roots that form screaming mouths. Security footage from unrelated facilities, hundreds of miles apart, has caught patients simultaneously mouthing the same phrase in dead languages. One linguist went mad attempting to translate it, carving Ashwood lives into the walls of his home with his fingernails. The chilling part: none of these people knew each other, but they dream of the same hallway, the same hum, the same red door that bleeds from the edges. Even those who merely watched recovered tapes have begun hearing the static in real life. It's not just memory, it's metastasis. Whatever they uncovered in Ashwood wasn't content with containment. It's viral, ideological, infectious through thought alone. And once you've glimpsed the truth, you don't get to unsee it. You carry it, and it carries you. Some doors once opened don't close behind you. Months after the last transmission from Ashwood, strange electromagnetic pulses still spike across the region at irregular intervals, like echoes from a dying scream no one else can hear. Birds fly in perfect circles over the ruined site. Shadows flicker across satellite images with no physical source. But the most chilling part isn't what happened there, it's what never left. Residents in nearby towns report hearing a low-frequency hum at night, always at 3:16 a.m., accompanied by lucid dreams of impossible staircases and children with blacked-out eyes whispering about the second awakening. A radio DJ who joked about Ashwood on air vanished during a live broadcast, his mic filled with static and distant wet breathing. No trace of him has been found. The government has officially closed the file, calling it an abandoned psychiatric rumour. But a new sub-forum has exploded online, filled with users claiming the same visions, the same dreams, and the same message scratched into mirrors. You heard it too. The deeper truth, maybe Ashwood didn't collapse. Maybe it bloomed. If you feel something watching you tonight, don't look away. Some stories linger because they speak to a truth we're too afraid to name. That reality isn't as solid as we want it to be. Ashwood was never about ghosts. It was about what happens when silence remembers you. And maybe deep down you felt it too. A frequency you can't unhear, a shadow in your memory you never invited. So ask yourself this: if it happened to them, could it happen to you? If this story unsettled something in you, drop your theory in the comments. We want to hear how far the echo reaches. Save this video for when the lights flicker again. Subscribe if you're brave enough to keep pulling at the thread, because the next story, it's already waiting.